You're listening to B2B Tech Talk with Ingram Micro, the place to learn about new technology and technological advances before they become mainstream. This podcast is sponsored by Dell Technologies, a unique family of businesses that provides the essential infrastructure for organizations to build their digital future, transform IT, and protect their most important asset, information. Let's get into the show.
Welcome to B2B Tech Talk with Ingram Micro. I'm your host, Keri Roberts, and my guest today is Milo Speranzo, the Director of North America Public Sector Marketing at Dell Technologies. Welcome, Milo. Thanks for being here today.
Hello, Keri. Thank you very much for having me. Excited to be a part of the podcast.
So today we're talking about the pivot to virtual marketing in the public sector. But before we do that, can you give us a little bit of history first as to what types of marketing used to be done quite often in the public sector?
Yeah, the history is going to be fairly short because it really culminates in one word, events, and a very in-person touch to our customers. So that simplifies it a little bit too much. However, I would say that 90% of our marketing efforts previously were on the track of in-person. So the events were big for us. It's hard to engage a government customer in the virtual world. It is much easier when you aggregate them into a in-person event. And obviously, that is drastically changing with the situation that we're in.
Yeah, and as you're mentioning, now we're kind of in this new normal, as people are calling it. It's obviously important to keep in touch with your customers, but it has to be different than the way it was done before, as you're suggesting, with things like happy hours or dinners. So what are some new and creative ways to engage customers in a virtual way?
Yeah, I have seen some very, very creative engagements in the last couple months. It makes me almost brings a tear to my eye. Makes me proud for my marketing brethren. I've seen everything from virtual chefs where there's a, Bobby Flay type of guy, and he is on with the customers teaching them how to cook steaks. But prior to that, there's a 30-minute product pitch. Obviously, webinars. I mean, I think we might have over-rotated on webinars, but that's the go-to of the day, webinars and webcasts and those types of engagements. But I would say that the customers are very thirsty for a way to supplant that info that they receive during those events. So they have been very widely appreciative of all of the ingenuity that we've seen come out there. So anything that's interactive, we've seen some great success with. So trivia, for instance, that's been one that's actually worked fairly well. The cooking classes are great. Virtual sommeliers. You can go through the list. We are absolutely trying everything. The good news is the customers, I believe, now that we've pivoted to this more virtual world, they're on board with us. They're okay if we crash and burn significantly during one of these virtual events. And it's like, well, that didn't quite work. They understand. So there's no harm in trying. So if I had to give some advice as we did pivot, it is try everything. Don't be worried about, a virtual failure. The customers are not going to hold it against you. They love the effort and they really want the touch points.
Well, I like that you're kind of bringing in some really different and creative ideas like trivia, because I think people always think it has to be so corporate, webinars only, very passive, but trivia is something that allows people to be interactive. So I love that you're bringing that as an option as well.
Yeah, it's tough. From a technology only standpoint, I know that's what we're talking about today. It is very difficult to do a technology laden, webinar, webcast, demo in a virtual environment. We're used to, we call them road shows or the tech talks, where we have our engineers come and physically bring equipment, sit in front of our customers and walk them through something, whether it's a demo or their own environments or just, upcoming products. That is well received in a one-on-one in-person environment, but virtually It's difficult. So it's difficult to maintain the attention of the customer, but it's also difficult really for the customer to grasp the technical content via, a Zoom or, a Teams meeting. So making sure that the marketing activity is interactive has been the absolute key to success. Everything has to have some sort of interactive capacity to it. Even our training modules that are virtual, we gamify them. There's some questions and choices as they go through. The engagement piece is extremely, extremely important, Keri. You hit it on the head.
Now, I'm curious, we're talking about the public sector, but even let's focus in a little bit more on education for a moment.
Sure.
How would you suggest an organization identifies the key stakeholders, especially in the education sector in 2020? Like, how do you get in front of these people? As you're saying before, 90% of the time you have to be in person. So what's the suggestion now to do that?
Yeah. And if you would have said January to March 2020, it would have been a different answer than March to this new odd normal that we're in 2020. But so the stakeholders honestly have been changing. So we have our typical, ITDMs, the IT decision makers, who we would call them in the past, in January, we would call them the decision makers. And then we would call the superintendents, the principals of the school, the business decision makers, we would call them the influencers. That has completely been turned on its head as of late. We see dollars coming in from different routes, the CARES Act, stimulus, recovery dollars, and it's made the business decision makers more of the deciders and the ITDMs more of the influencers. So it's really, from an engagement model, it's knowing what they need. So right now, our ITDMs in education need to influence the business decision makers to get their priorities at the top of their list. So when those dollars come in, there's a lot of competing priorities now, whether it's free lunches at the schools. And, when those dollars roll in, they're going to stem the tide in a lot of cases to help in the new world of education. Our ITDMs, our CIOs, our CISOs at the school districts, our CTOs, they're looking almost for us to help them with unsolicited proposals to those superintendents to say, hey, you have this, this money, or we really need this for remote school, or we really have an issue right now with connectivity and our kids are having to come to the parking lot and do their, homework. Everybody needs a hotspot to take home with them. So the best way to engage right now on the education side is to know what our decision makers and influencers need in the new normal. And it is something very different. So our ITDMs are actively looking to us to build unsolicited type of proposals. I know I've used that one twice, but lack of a better term, for them to engage. So we're actually teaching them how to engage with their business decision makers, which is very different.
Now, you're talking about stimulus dollars. Let's talk about that a little bit more in 2020. Can you share with us, as far as you know, what kind of funding the education vertical was given, and what can they use the funding for as well?
Yeah. So from a stimulus perspective, for all of my marketing brothers and sisters out there, if you are not laser focused right now on stimulus, you're really missing the boat. I know that's a strong term, but we did some research earlier. Oh goodness, all the months are running together now. I don't know what it was. It was probably in April we completed the research, and we tracked government stimulus dollars, U.S. government stimulus dollars. We went all the way back to essentially World War I, but prior, I believe. Anytime there was a national emergency or disaster where U.S. stimulus dollars were injected into the economy. So, you had the Depression, the market crash in 1929, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam, all the way up through our most recent disasters where stimulus has been injected after 9/11, of course, and the recession of 2007 and 2008. there were some striking similarities as to what those stimulus dollars meant for technology. Now, obviously, in 1906, technology was defined very differently than it is in 2020. It was just like, look how cool we can bend this metal. That's technology, manufacturing technology. And now it's more apples to apples to what we think of as technology. But we see these massive injections follow a very similar path. From day one after crisis to month 18 after the crisis, we see the majority of the stimulus dollars injected into the economy. And this holds true as well. We did this research globally, but just for the US now, we see the majority of the dollars injected. So for this pandemic, mid-March, and then we project that out 18 months after, we see the majority. So we're projecting now about $4 to $5 trillion, the US, which is hard to even fathom sometimes, but $4 to $5 trillion, if not more, injected into the economy in the first 18 months after the crisis. Now, that's a good benchmark as to where the money will be housed, I guess, or sit, because it is not spent in those 18 months. This is not an 18-month project. So for all the marketers out there, we see the dollars spent, the majority of them spent between month 18 and month 36. We see recession dollars from 2008, recession stimulus dollars from 2008, still being spent in 2017. It was 10 years later almost. So this is something that when you strategize for your public sector marketing over the next, quarter, year, 3 years, 5 years, you really have to take into account those stimulus dollars. Think about them, plan, engage consultants, your virtual, your messaging, your events, those education. I know we started on education and I have wandered this wildly into everything else, but those ITDMs from an education standpoint will need that same type of unique help, not for the next 12 months. They're going to need those unsolicited proposals or help engaging their superintendents for the next 3 to 5 to 7 years as these stimulus dollars continue to hit the market. So stimulus is top priority for me as we go forward. And it's top priority for a couple reasons. There is an altruistic, it's not just capturing our fair share or unfair share of those dollars. That is really where human progress and the progress against this disaster will occur and how those dollars are spent. So if you want to be a part, if your company wants to be a part of that leading edge that's helping drive us past the pandemic, you got to do it. It's going to be done on the backs of those stimulus dollars. So very, very important.
I didn't realize that stimulus spending for a sector could expand, like you said, out to 10 years.
Yeah, we had a guesstimate at it, and we looked back at the recession, obviously the most recent crisis, I guess, for lack of a better term, that we had. And I honestly, we were working with 5-6 consultants, our government affairs team, and a lot of us said, we think this is going to be next 3 years. We really have to focus next 3 years. It was semi-shocking when we came back, and it was not an anomaly. We saw the recession dollars from 2008. They were released in 2008. We saw some of those dollars. Now, it was a smaller percentage, but a small percentage of trillions of dollars is still a good bit of addressable market being spent in 2000. I think it was 10 years later, 9 years later, 2017. So, we said, was that an anomaly? And we went back and we looked at, right after 9/11, and it was the same way. 6-7 years we saw that spend, all the way back to the market crash. I think it was 1929. We saw stimulus dollars from that, and 7 years later, still being spent at the state and local government level. So that was an eye opener for me too.
No, we're talking about the education vertical specifically. I mean, obviously, like you said, we've had stimulus dollars come in for many different times, but this is the first time where we can't be in person for things. And so some schools are trying to go back, some are doing half days, some are still going to do online.
Yeah.
In your personal opinion, what do you suggest maybe the best way for the U.S. education system to maybe spend these stimulus dollars?
Personally, so there's a couple of different answers to this, and I know you're asking me for one, and I'm terrible at answering questions the way you would want me to, so I apologize. I would, connectivity is key. So this first tranche of stimulus dollars that came in, a lot of it went to just keeping the schools running, the free lunch programs, the getting additional devices. So, Chromebooks and supply chain is an issue, and that would take me off in a whole separate tangent. But I think right now, where there is a major gap is in connectivity. So, and I don't mean rural broadband connectivity. I mean, we are seeing major issues at the Detroit public school systems, which is very much a city-based school system where the kids just don't have access to any sort of reliable connection, internet connection. And they're having to figure out ways to get to the parking lots of the school to sit there daily and do their work. And it's not attainable for a lot of the kids, whether they don't have their parents are working or they don't have the means to get to the school, or a device breaks and there is no backup for the device and it just lasts, it could be months. So that connectivity lends itself to a couple different areas. One is the cloud. I believe the school districts are doing the right thing. They are, now how they're doing it, I disagree in some cases, but they are rotating towards cloud-based learning. Now they're going towards what they know. So there's a lot of push into, some of your typical cloud-based services, where they really should be thinking more for the long term and setting up a more of a multi-cloud, hybrid cloud environment, building their own school districts' data centers up at the educational service centers, and building a robust infrastructure to support the kids. So going to cloud, I think, is extremely important, obviously, and then doing it right and building it for the long term is key. On the back end, figuring out an actual repeatable, consumable way to make sure these kids are, have the connections they need. So investing with the telecom companies for hotspots, which is what we see. There is some bridging the gap there with some of the hotspots, but building more, let's call it Wi-Fi, educational Wi-Fi connection points in the community, so they can walk up the street. It's almost like the busing system. Where are the bus stops? Let's put some Wi-Fi on those poles on the corners. And I know that's a very simplified way, and it won't work. And you have to build the infrastructure behind it, or build a pavilion essentially for them to sit on there. But there's ways to do it, whether it's at the local parks, at the, and create safe areas for the kids to study. That is right now, I think, the biggest barrier to true productivity, full productivity in online learning. And it all stems from really lack of connectivity.
No, I think you're making some really good points today. And, bringing to light that even though it's the United States, every school system is completely different and different problems. But you're right. Having that connection for the students is of utmost importance. And I want to switch just slightly and talk about the Federal Reserve System. For those that aren't aware, can you tell us how money is spent in the Federal Reserve System and how it's different from the rest of the public sector?
Yeah, well, so I think this question is a stimulus question as well. And it is spent very differently. It is very cumbersome in a lot of cases. And this flows outside of just federal into, federal spending. State and local government will mimic federal spending as well. And it is quite the process for them to even spend their money, let alone, spend it effectively. It's so cumbersome that, frankly, within the government, the planning phase takes so long, they end up spending the majority of their money in the last 8 weeks of the fiscal year, because that's when it's ready to spend. So I think it's 40%, I forget what the stat is, 40% of the dollars are spent between August and September, which October 1 is the beginning of their new fiscal year. So knowing how those dollars are spent and who spends them, who the decision makers are, who the influencers are, is absolutely key for marketing in the public sector. Same as, I guess, same as stimulus with different stakeholders. So, for instance, the chief procurement officer at a federal agency is extremely important to engage with. I would say that is the biggest gap right now that I see when I do the road shows and talk on the panels, and I talk to some of my peers at some of the other tech companies. They are laser focused at talking to the CIOs, and that's fine. I mean, that's good. The CIOs, they're definitely influencers and decision makers. But I say I'll throw out the acronym CPO, and you'll just get blank stares. And the chief procurement officer, the COTAR, the contracting officers, technical representatives, if those aren't in your repertoire, if those aren't in your target audience, you are really missing, I'd say, half of the decision-making ability within the public sector. So that money is spent in a very methodical way. And I think everybody knows this, that does market in the public sector. There are requirements for the spend. So there's socioeconomic goals that each of our government customers have. And if your team doesn't have a socioeconomic status, service disabled, veteran-owned small business, minority-owned business, women-owned business, you have to find team members because they are absolutely serious when it comes to hitting their goals around those socioeconomic disadvantaged businesses. So one, you might want to take your marketing if you are a larger, tech company, a larger reseller, and a lot of folks have this already, but really take a look and build your, let's call it your diversity database and market to them. Find the top service disabled, veteran-owned small businesses that are working with the VA right now and market to them, engage them as a team member or a reseller. If you're a larger tech company, you need let's call it a diversified business database. And if you don't have one, you're missing the boat. Also, you need to tailor your message towards that, let's call it the underserved audience within the government, the chief procurement officers, the COTARs, the compliance officers at the agencies. They are like sponges. They want to hear from us. Now, they don't want to hear about, how many nodes are in each, the tech talk to them, right over their heads. But they do want to hear how compliant your supply chain is, how secure your supply chain is, your cybersecurity stance, what you can do from a support perspective, how flexible you are with your support packages, and really ease of procurement. And I do see there are misses with my peers and the reselling community around engaging, let's call it I've said it again, maybe we coin it, but that underserved audience. And that is key in this very complex engagement with the government as they try to spend their money.
I want to go a little bit more granular here, with all of this knowledge, and we're navigating a new way to reach and connect with the public sector. Do you, as a marketing person yourself, do you have any suggestions of written copy or wording that might be best during this time that makes a partner sensitive to what's going on, but still shows how and why a certain vertical should work with them?
Yeah. So, that brings up a couple different points. So this might not be a super politically correct way to say it. I don't know, but ambulance chasing, you don't want to be, one, you don't want to look like an ambulance chaser, but two, you don't want to be an ambulance chaser. That morally, I don't know. I just have a conflict with that. But in reality, even if I had no moral conflict with it and I was just trying to make money on the backs of a pandemic, my Lord, can they read through that? So we've had many advisory boards. So, and this is from education to state and local government to federal government. We've had the top CIOs from Suzette Kent and fed to the CIO of Pennsylvania and California school districts to, mayors and politicians at the state and local level. And they've all very resoundingly said the same thing. If it looks like you're trying to make money on the back of a pandemic and just sell them widgets and bombard them with information, and this is what you need, if that's your message and that's the perception that they have all said resoundingly, we will not forget that as we come out of this pandemic. And they are, a technical term, grossed out by it. So they have told us in lengthy, some diatribes with some of these CIOs, that how they've seen that with some of our peer IT companies. And they've come in just saying, you need to do this. And then they've price gouged on the back end. And there was no sensitivity. So from a message standpoint, in that case, the message really is, and the want is, you have to want this. If you don't want it, if your company, especially if you're a reseller, if your core charter isn't actually this, the message tends to be very see-through. But you have to want to, and you have to talk to these customers as though you're a partner. You want to help them. There are areas you want to come in, you want to talk, you want to engage. What are the real problems right now? Our best message has been throwing right out the window what our salespeople have been talking to our customers about for the past year. Our sellers are out there, they're engaged. Our message is, multi-cloud, and let's go, and here's how you secure it, and your data protection, and this, and blah, 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 blah. You have to stop. You just have to stop, and you have to re-baseline with your customer. And that's what they want to hear. That's the message. They want you to come back in and say, hey, I've been trying to sell you these 10 servers for the past 6 months. I'm not going to talk to you about servers anymore. You got about 10 other fires right now due to this pandemic, due to, civil unrest, due to whatever is happening in the environment. I'm done talking. Listen, these servers, they're there. They're there when you need them. Would love to sell them to you. They're the best. We have the best stuff. That's going to still be there. In reality, I'm done. That's not the message. That's not what I'm going to talk to you about. I'm going to talk to you about, what do you actually need right now? What will stem the tide? Do you need better connectivity for, education? Do you need video surveillance, or not surveillance, but analytics? Do you need video analytics? Do you need a thermal imaging solution for your facilities, for your hospitals, to help try to monitor your mass amount of people that are coming into your federal buildings or state buildings and monitor their, temperatures in some sort of effective way? Tell me what you need. So it has changed, to your point, Keri. The message that's resonating now is much more of a business, a problem discussion, as opposed to a typical IT marketing selling type of engagement. And that is key. You have to keep it conversational. You have to bring it back to the baseline. Sometimes our messaging right now has no tech talk even in it. There's no talk of technology at all. It is, how can we help? But, maybe it isn't technology. Maybe they just need, volunteers to help them train up some of their temporary workers that are doing help desk, something like that. It's making it conversational.
And I think that's something that is important all the time. It's just even more important during 2020.
I agree. I completely agree. It is always important. Those are the door openers. That is what, great marketers do the best. The difference now is there's a very, very much a heightened sensitivity to, let's call it, ambulance chasing. And that is going to really hurt your company for years to come. And we talked about it with the stimulus dollars. This is a good tie-in. You have to look to the future. Those stimulus dollars, they're going to be spent for the next 5-7 years. These CIOs, these IT decision makers in general, and I would assume, I'm guessing here, we haven't done the same focal groups with the business decision makers. They will, or they are adamant that they will remember who their true partners were in a time of crisis. So this is a time to really just focus on being their partner.
Now, when you think of technology as a whole, where do you see it going within the next year?
Oh, 5G. I don't know. I mean, I am hearing, so we hear a lot of the buzzwords just like you do, but that 5G buzzword is one that is really, really sticking around, and the edge computing, being able to compute on the edge, and how that will be a complete game changer once we can actually institute 5G. And I know in Fed, since we're talking public sector, there are a lot of significant 5G trials happening right now that in just a micro level at some of the, the defense agencies, DoD, the Air Force, their trials, it is changing the way they think about IT and what they can do and how much they can, if they can compute that quickly on the edge, do they need the same type of data centers that they have? Do they, what does their cloud look like in the future? Honestly, I think 5G is something really to watch because it's happening quickly. I really do believe that the stimulus dollars that will be, we think, our government affairs team is following an infrastructure stimulus play right now. And infrastructure doesn't necessarily mean roads and bridges. It does, but it also means technology infrastructure. And if it's a $2 trillion plan, that could really ramp up the timeline for 5G, where it was, in the next 3 years, we see it, as being semi-widely available. Those stimulus dollars at that amount of money and focus and need, frankly, just because of so much remote work and remote schooling, I think could accelerate that 5G timeline. And the compute power you have at your edge devices, at your phone, at your, the cameras, at the sensors, at that level, it will reverberate through the entire IT stack of all of these agencies and just change the way they do tech. So, I would say that's a big one to keep your eye on.
Milo, we've talked a lot about marketing in the public sector, especially education today. If people have questions or they want to connect with you, where is the best place to do that?
Yeah, no. So there's, from an Ingram perspective, we've got a couple great folks on that side. So you can always reach out to your Ingram team, Glenn Jeffries, just how it sounds, at ingrammicro.com, and Christopher Martin at ingrammicro.com. Couldn't ask for two easier names to write down, and I'm sure this will be in the link for the podcast. You can also reach out to me via LinkedIn, Milo Speranzo on LinkedIn, and I try to keep that feed as active as humanly possible. So I think I put some good info out there. If I don't, please let me know. And if there's something else you want to hear, if you want to connect directly, just send me a note.
Well, thank you so much, Milo, for sharing your knowledge, your excitement, and understanding for what's going on today.
Of course. Thank you, Keri. Thanks for having me. And thanks to the Ingram Micro team for putting this together.
If you like this episode or have a question, join the discussion on Twitter at Ingram TechSol with the hashtag B2B Tech Talk. Thank you for tuning in and subscribing to B2B Tech Talk with Ingram Micro.
You've been listening to B2B Tech Talk with Ingram Micro, hosted by Keri Roberts. This episode was sponsored by Dell Technologies. B2B Tech Talk is a joint production with Sweetfish Media and Ingram Micro. Ingram Micro production handled by Laura Burton. To not miss an episode, subscribe today to your favorite podcast platform.